good evening, or perhaps good night. Wherever you are in the world, and whatever hour has brought you here, you are welcome. Tonight we travel north to a colder time, to a quieter world, where wisdom was not given freely, but paid for in blood. Long before Ragnarok, before the fall of the gods, Odin, the Allfather, stood at the edge of a sacred well, a well that held knowledge of all things, past, present, and what had not yet come to pass. And to drink from it, he would have to give up something no god had ever surrendered before. This is the story of the night Odin lost his eye and gained the wisdom to see the end of the world. Settle in, slow your breath, and let the story begin. They say Odin never slept, not because he could not, but because dreams had become too loud. In the high halls of Asgard, where golden beams caught starlight like insects in amber, the Allfather paced. Night was long in the Nine Realms, but in his mind, it was longer still. Each step he took echoed across unseen branches, deeper than roots, louder than wind. The ravens knew. They did not ask, they watched. One eye open, one eye watching, but the other, restless. Odin had seen wars, started some, ended others. He bartered with time, hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 nights to steal the runes. He tasted death, named it, and spat it back into the void. But tonight, something was different. The tree groaned, not with age, with warning. Beneath the bark of the world tree, something stirred. Not a creature, not a god, a whisper, a wordless sound that moved like breath beneath skin. Not a message, a memory. Not his, but it knew him. He left the hall without speaking. Frigg watched him go. She did not stop him. She never did. Not when he vanished into fog. Not when he returned with blood on his spear and silence in his heart. Odin was not a god you could hold. He was a god you watched vanish and waited to mourn. Outside, the wind bowed. The sky thinned. Stars blinked one by one, like a herd sensing a predator. Yggdrasil loomed, not above, but around. Its branches were not branches. They were roads. Its bark was not bark. It was time, layered and cracked. Odin placed his hand upon it, and the whisper stopped. He turned his head. No one was there. Yet something waited, beneath him, beneath the 9 realms, beneath even hell. Something that once had a name, something thirsty. The ravens shifted. One blinked, the other did not. "You hear it," Odin said. They did not reply. They never needed to. Their wings beat once and were still. The gods above Asgard whispered, not among each other, but to themselves. Even Thor, half drunk and red with the heat of mead, felt a chill in his spine. He left his hammer where it lay and did not ask why. Odin walked. Each step echoed, not outward, downward. Not across the 9 realms, but inward, into something old. He passed through forests that remembered giants' footsteps, past caves where dwarves no longer sang. The world did not greet him, it braced. They say a god cannot be humbled, but the tree did not care what he was. At the base of Yggdrasil, in a hollow not carved but earned, Odin knelt, not in prayer, in negotiation. The whisper returned, this time closer. It had no voice, yet it spoke, and what it said was this: "You already know the question." Odin closed his eye, and in the darkness he saw well. Deep, still, and waiting, he opened his mouth. No words came. He wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. He stood and walked on, toward the only place that frightened him, toward the water that remembered too much, toward the night that asked for more than blood, toward Mimir's well. There are things even gods do not speak of. Roots older than gods, wells deeper than death, questions that twist their way up through bark and bone and memory. And Odin had heard one, just once, long ago. Not with his ears, with something deeper, and it had waited for him to be desperate enough to return. He was not afraid. Gods do not fear, but they remember what fear felt like. And tonight he remembered, not for himself, but for what lay ahead. He passed Heimdall on the bridge. The watchman did not move, did not blink, only said one thing: do not ask unless you are ready to know. Odin did not answer. Some questions echo longer when left unheard. Downward still, through ash-choked canyons where fire giants once danced, over graves of beasts never named, past runestones too old to remember who carved them, all silent, all watching. The whisper followed him, or perhaps preceded him. He could not tell. It was not in the air, it was in the earth, and now it was in him. When he stopped to rest, the stars shifted above, not because time passed, but because he had passed it, stepped out of ours and into something colder, older, hungrier. In a clearing where snow never melted, a wolf watched him pass. Not Fenrir, but kin, the kind that did not howl, only waited. The trees thinned, the light changed. He was near the place where stories died, where names unraveled, where even memory forgot itself. He pressed his fingers into the soil, felt it pulse once, like a heartbeat. Slow, massive, unending. The roots of Yggdrasil did not end. They only turned inward, knotted around secrets too big to rise. He spoke, just one word, and the whisper stopped, then answered, not with sound, with understanding, the kind that leaves scars on the soul. Behind him, the wind forgot its name, the cold forgot its teeth. Only the path remained, and Odin walked it toward Mimir, toward the truth that should not be known, toward the price he already knew he would pay. The whisper became a shape in his mind, not a face, not a voice, a weight, a presence, something that had waited not for him, but for this moment. It did not want worship, it wanted witness. Asgard grew small behind him, not in distance, in importance. The throne, the spear, the power, all of it shrank, because the eye he still carried was not enough, not for what he needed. He remembered his ravens, how one brought knowledge, and the other brought memory. But what he sought now was not either. It was something older than knowing, older than remembering, a third thing, a missing thing, and it waited in the water. He reached the base of the tree again, fell to his knees, not out of weakness, out of weight. The story pressed down upon him, and still he listened. Odin, who had sacrificed himself to himself, now faced something he could not name. And it smiled, not with lips, but with silence, not with joy, but with hunger. And the whisper asked again, "Are you ready to see what the gods refuse to name?" He did not answer. Instead, he breathed in, and with that breath, gave up the right to forget. He rose, not as king, not as god, as seeker. He walked on, into a night that would not end, toward a well that had no bottom, carrying not hope, but one question. and one eye too many. Behind him, the sky held its breath. Even the stars, those ancient witnesses to every oath and betrayal, dared not watch too closely, for they knew where he walked and they knew the cost. There was once a tale told by an old vulva, half mad and half blind. She claimed that before the first tree grew, before even the frost met flame, a god had already made this walk. Not Odin, not any god known to name, but one who gave everything to see and saw too much. She said the world still weeps in places he stepped, and in the silence between waves, he still whispers warnings no one can understand. Odin remembered her words now, not with faith, with caution, because if she was wrong, he would be first. But if she was right, he would not return the same. One eye would remain his, the other would belong to the well, to the voice without breath, to the knowledge no god was meant to hold. And so, with no more prayers and no more delay, Odin passed beneath the last bough of Yggdrasil, into shadow, into silence, into the place where even gods must bargain with the dark beneath the roots. And the whisper, for the first time, trembled, for the All-Father had come, and he had not come to ask, he had come to pay. Odin departed from the halls of Asgard alone. He told no one where he was going, not even Frigg, not his ravens, not Thor. This was not an errand for diplomacy or war. It was personal, and he believes no other god could understand what called him. The Well of Mimir was not a common destination even for gods. It lay far beyond the known paths, deeper than any realm with a name. The last time Odin approached it, he had walked the edge of death itself. Now he returned, not because he wanted more knowledge, but because something had changed. The previous night, he heard something he hadn't heard in centuries. A whisper. It had no voice. It had no direction, but it had meaning. It suggested that the well had awakened again, or at least that it was willing to receive another sacrifice. Odin crossed Bifrost without ceremony. Heimdall didn't stop him. There was an understanding between them. If Odin was going to the well, it was not to return soon. From there, he moved into the deep territories of the World Tree, 3 realms most beings avoided. These places were neither Niflheim, nor Helheim, nor the shining branches of Asgard. They were intermediary zones, untouched by history, unmapped by the Norns. No god kept watch there, no beast hunted. It was a corridor of the unknown, defined not by danger, but by silence. Odin walked at a consistent pace. He did not stop to eat or sleep. His body could endure the journey. It had done so before. The real challenge was not physical. It was mental. The closer he came to the well, the more the silence pressed into his thoughts. There were no landmarks, no stars above, no wind. Even time felt like it stretched thin. Odin measured his progress by memories. At one point, he recalled a gnarled tree where he once encountered a riddle carved into its bark. It was still there, but the tree had fallen and decayed. That told him centuries had passed in this path, though he had walked only for hours. Eventually, he came to a low valley, where the soil darkened and the roots of Yggdrasil grew thick and low. This was where the known world ended. Odin paused there, not in hesitation, but to confirm. He placed his palm on one of the roots. It was cold. That meant the well was awake. He continued. As he descended into the valley, his breath grew heavy, not from exertion, but from pressure. Something was pushing back, not to stop him, but to make sure he was aware of the cost of proceeding. Odin began to remember details he didn't choose to recall. Faces of those he had sacrificed in battle. Words he had once said to mortals before sending them to die. The well was testing his resolve. There was no voice, no illusions, just memory resurfacing with clarity and force. He allowed it. After what felt like a full day of walking, he saw the first sign. A single stone pillar, about shoulder height, half sunken into the ground. It was covered in runes, but Odin didn't read them. He had carved them himself on his last visit. They mark the boundary between the living and the knowing. Beyond that point, no truth could be unseen. No knowledge could be forgotten. He stepped past it. The terrain changed. The ground grew smoother, darker, more uniform. No vegetation, no stone, just compacted earth, dark as a iron. Odin continued forward without hesitation. Eventually he reached an incline. It wasn't steep, but it signaled that he was leaving the surface layer of the roots. The incline led downward into a tunnel formed not by erosion, but by design. The tunnel was old, possibly older than the gods themselves. It was not carved, it was grown. The walls were smooth and slightly warm to the touch. There were no lights, but Odin didn't need them. He could see in the dark well enough. And more importantly, the path didn't branch. It led in a single direction, down. As he descended, he counted his steps. Not for any ritualistic reason, but to maintain focus. The silence here wasn't just passive. It was heavy. It attempted to confuse. The Well of Mimir didn't want seekers who arrived casually. It wanted sacrifice. It wanted clarity. At 1,003 steps, he reached the first sign of change. A ring of white stones circled the tunnel floor. He stepped over them without pause. The test was not in the stones. It was in what came after. Odin began to feel pressure on his remaining eye. Not pain exactly, but something unfamiliar. A pressure that came from behind his vision, as if his mind was adjusting to receive something it wasn't yet ready for. This was normal. The closer one came to the well, the more the boundary between thought and reality weakened. Dreams could bleed into the air, fears could take shape, but none had yet, which meant he was still welcome. That could change. Odin paused to drink from his flask. The water was cold, and that surprised him. He hadn't felt temperature in days. It meant the well's influence was increasing. It was drawing him in, physically, mentally, spiritually. Eventually, the tunnel ended. The exit was not a doorway. It was a sheer drop into an open chamber. Odin stood at the edge and looked down. There was no bomb in sight, just darkness and a single echo that pulsed every few seconds, like a heartbeat. He stepped off the edge, and the fall began. The fall did not accelerate. It was steady, controlled, as though something was regulating his descent. Odin did not panic. He had fallen farther before, into worse places. Still, this descent was unlike any other. It did not obey gravity. It obeyed intention. After what felt like a full minute, his feet touched ground. The chamber was enormous. There were no walls in sight. The floor was made of the same dark material as the tunnel, smooth, featureless. Above him, there was only black, and in the center of it all, he saw the well. It did not look like a well, not in the traditional sense. There was no stone ring, no rope, no bucket. It was a circular depression in the floor, wide and impossibly deep. The surface shimmered slightly, but it was not water. It was something denser, something reactive. Odin approached it slowly. The pressure in his head intensified, but he remained upright. When he came within a few meters, the shimmer stopped. The surface of the well became still, flat, reflective. He saw himself clearly, older than before, more worn. Still a god, but a god with questions. He said nothing. The well required no speech. He waited. The silence stretched for an unknown period of time. Then, without warning, a ripple moved across the surface. It did not distort the reflection. It revealed it. Behind his own image, Odin saw another. A face. Not human, not divine, just present. It did not speak, but Odin understood. He would not gain access to the knowledge here unless he offered something in return. And what was required would not be small. This time, the price would be part of himself. Not a limb, not a memory, but something harder to give. Something that could not be restored. He would give his eye. He had always known this moment would come. But knowing and doing are different. So he stood there, silent, until the resolve formed in full. This would not be an offering made in pain. It would be made in certainty. The well did not demand blood. It demanded proof. Proof that Odin understood what he was about to do. And that he would not ask for anything he wasn't prepared to carry forever. He stepped back and sat, not to rest, but to decide, in full awareness, because after this there would be no turning back. The well did not rush him. It did not need to. It had waited for centuries. It would wait a few minutes more. And Odin, god of war and wisdom, sat in absolute silence, until silence became agreement. He rose without ceremony. The next step would not be easy, but it would be final. And once it was made, the eye he gave would never see again, but it would never stop watching. Odin stood up. The well had not changed, but the atmosphere around it had. The air was thither, not physically, but perceptually. He sensed another presence in the chamber, though he neither heard nor saw anything. He waited. After several minutes, he noticed something new. The reflection on the well's surface no longer showed only himself. There was now a second figure. It stood directly behind him in the image. Yet when he turned around, nothing was there. The figure had no clear form, no face, no clothing, just a vertical silhouette, completely black, absorbing all light. It stood still. Odin did not speak. He didn't need to. The presence was not an entity in the traditional sense. It was a threshold. It existed only to prevent unworthy beings from approaching the well. He had encountered it once before during his first visit. At that time, it had not let him pass until he proved his intent through self-sacrifice. Hanging himself from Yggdrasil had been the proof. The being had not reacted physically. It had simply disappeared once the sacrifice was complete. Now it was back, and this time it would demand something greater. Odin took a step forward. The figure did not move, but the pressure increased immediately. A sensation spread across Odin's chest and into his skull. It was not pain. It was a warning. The threshold did not need words. He understood. Do not proceed until the offering is made. There were no negotiations, no appeals. The presence was not sentient in a way that could be reasoned with. It was a rule, an embodiment of the condition itself. Odin took a deep breath and reached inside his cloak. From within he retrieved a small, dark stone. It had no magical properties. It was a marker. a reminder he had carried with him for centuries to prepare for this moment. He placed the stone on the ground in front of the well. Then he knelt. This was not ritualistic behavior. It was preparation. What he was about to do would change him permanently. He closed his eye, the one he still had, and focused. There was no need for tools, no need for weapons. The sacrifice had to come from him directly and willingly. He placed 2 fingers over his right eye. Slowly, with deliberate movement, he pressed in. It was not immediate. It took strength, patience, and resolve. The pain was considerable, but Odin made no sound. Pain was not the cost. The cost was permanence. When it was done, he stood again. Blood marked the ground. His right eye was gone. The figure in the reflection vanished. That was the sign. He was now allowed to approach the well. Odin moved forward, step by step, until he stood directly at the edge. The surface reacted again, this time, not with a ripple, but with a glow. A soft light, not bright, but constant. It meant his offering had been accepted. He waited. There would be no visions, no voices. The well communicated through transfer, not dialogue. What he would receive was not an answer. It was access. Odin placed both hands on the edge of the well. The moment his skin made contact with the surface, the sensation changed. It was not liquid, nor was it solid. It was pressure. It pushed back as if evaluating his intent once again. Then it gave way. His thoughts began to accelerate, not randomly, but in a focused direction. The well was not reading his mind. It was directing it, pulling specific threads of memory, insight, and vision into alignment. This was how the well granted knowledge. It did not speak truths. It structured understanding. Odin's body remained still, but internally, his consciousness expanded. He saw images, structures, patterns that explained the connections between past, present, and future events. Not prophecies, frameworks. The well showed possibilities, not certainties. He learned that sacrifice was not a moment, but a continuum. His loss of the eye was a threshold, but not the full cost. The understanding he was gaining would change how he saw everything, including himself. He became aware of the consequences of choice, how the smallest decisions in one realm echoed across others, how withholding one truth could create imbalance across generations, how action without understanding caused failure even among gods. This knowledge was not comfortable. It revealed flaws in his past decisions, not to shame him, but to prepare him. Leadership without self-awareness was unsustainable. The well made that clear. Odin did not resist. He accepted the exposure. He had not come to reinforce his power. He had come to make it sustainable. The longer he stayed connected to the well, the more the knowledge deepened. The process wasn't instantaneous. It occurred in layers. He had to process each concept fully before the next one could emerge. He began to understand the true origin of certain realms, how some were not created, but formed through reactions to divine decisions. Helheim, for example, wasn't only a place of the dead. It was a system that preserved equilibrium in the cosmic cycle. Without it, souls would accumulate in the wrong places, disrupting the flow of power. He saw that Midgard's fragility was not a flaw, but a feature. It was designed as a learning ground where decisions carried immediate consequence. Its instability made it critical, and that was why so many forces, divine and otherwise, sought to influence it. The well also revealed information about others. Thor's eventual crisis of strength, Loki's future betrayal, and Frigg's unseen doubts. It was not prophecy, it was potential. The well showed conditions under which these outcomes would unfold. What mattered now was how Odin chose to respond. He knew he couldn't stop every failure or prevent every catastrophe, but he could prepare, and more importantly, he could change how he taught others to lead. Wisdom was not just in knowing, it was in guiding. Eventually, the flow slowed. Not because it was complete, but because the well only gave what he could handle. Odin stepped back from the edge. He was dizzy, but not disoriented. His eye was gone, but his vision had expanded. The guardian figure did not return. It had no further role. Odin had passed the threshold, paid the cost, and received the knowledge. There was nothing else to prove. He turned away from the well and began walking toward the edge of the chamber. He did not need a guide. The path back would reveal itself when it was time. That was the nature of the well. It only kept what was not ready to leave. As he walked, he began mentally organizing what he had seen. Some of it would take years to integrate. Other parts were immediately useful. He now understood how to better structure Asgard's defenses, how to prevent internal rivalries from erupting into civil conflict, and how to slow Ragnarok, not stop it, but delay it. That was the most important revelation. Inevitability could be shaped. The fall of the gods was not a fixed date. It was a convergence of choices. If those choices changed, the timeline could shift. Perhaps not forever, but long enough to prepare the next generation. Odin did not smile. He didn't feel victorious. He felt responsible. That was the true cost of knowledge, ownership of consequence. When he reached the edge of the chamber, the wall that had not existed before now opened. A narrow passage led upward. It was time to return. He took one last look at the well. It no longer glowed. It was still, dormant, until the next time it was needed. The climb out of the well's domain took time, but it was not difficult. The path was stable, the wall solid. The influence of the chamber lessened with each step. By the time he reached the top, he felt the weight begin to lift, but the understanding remained. He emerged into the surface layer beneath Yggdrasil. The same pale roots arched overhead. The same dark soil met his boots. But everything was different. He had entered seeking knowledge. He had left bearing its burden. Nothing had attacked him. Nothing had tried to stop him. Because the real test was never survival. It was comprehension. And now that he carried it, the well would not call again. Not until the next mind was ready. Not until the next eye was willing. When Odin emerged from the root domain, he paused briefly to get his bearings. The world above had not changed. Yggdrasil's branches still loomed overhead, the wind was still absent. But Odin was not the same. He knew what came next. Knowledge without preservation would fade. What the well had given him needed to be sealed, both as a form of containment and as proof of the cost. That process was not automatic. It had to be initiated by the one who received the knowledge. Odin walked to a place he had passed revere, a flat stone embedded in the soil, shaped naturally like a disc. He cleared the top of debris and sat down. There were no spells involved, no chanting. The seal was not magical in the traditional sense. It was psychological, metaphysical, and biological. It involved marking the body and the mind simultaneously. He took a blade from his side. It was not his spear, Gungnir. It was a smaller tool meant for delicate work. First, he cut into his palm. Shallow but precise, the blood flowed. He smeared it in a circular motion across the stone surface. Then he closed his eye, his remaining one, and began the internal process. He mentally reconstructed the key insights the well had shown him: the ripple effect structure of decisions, the true systemic function of Helheim, the fragility of Midgard as a deliberate mechanism, and the conditional timelines of Ragnarok. These were not images, they were structures. He compressed them, not erased them, not forgotten, compressed. The compression required effort. His breathing slowed. His posture stiffened. Mentally, he pushed the structures inward, linking them to the neural pathways of memory, but separating them from daily access. It was not about hiding the knowledge. It was about preventing instability. The well's insights had the potential to overwhelm even a god's cognitive limits if accessed too frequently. Once the knowledge was secured, Odin moved to the second part of the seal, externalization. He retrieved a piece of bark from a nearby root, Yggdrasil's own. From another pouch, he removed a shard of obsidian. Using the shard, he began to etch markings into the bark. These were not spells. They were triggers, simple patterns that would help him retrieve compressed knowledge under specific conditions. The bark would be stored in his vault in Asgard. Not hidden, but not labeled either. Only he would recognize it for what it was. This part took time. Each mark had to be exact. Each line mirrored a cognitive date, a memory loop, or a decision vector. If one was incorrect, the recall process would fail. Odin worked patiently. When he finished, he checked the pattern 3 times. Satisfied, he stood up. The seal was complete. He placed the bark in a protective cloth, bound it, and returned to the pouch. The stone beneath him was now stained. His blood, absorbed by the surface, left a faint mark. Not magical, but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. It would remain as a witness. Odin remained still for a moment longer. The sealing process had trained him in a different way than battle or travel. This was not physical fatigue. It was structural. His mind had been reshaped, and now his body was adjusting. He looked around. The clearing was empty, silent, but he knew he was not alone. The moment the seal was complete, the Norns became aware of it. They did not appear, nor did they speak, but their awareness pressed faintly into the edge of his perception. Not in judgment, in acknowledgement. They recorded everything, not with ink or stone, but through threads. And now, the thread of his sacrifice had been woven into their tapestry. This knowledge would not be public. Even most gods would never hear about it. Odin would not share the details with Thor, Balder, or even Frigg. Not yet, perhaps not ever. But the signs would be visible. Those attuned to deeper layers of reality would see the change in him. His behavior, his strategy, his gaze. That was why the seal mattered. Without it, the new knowledge would leak into dreams, into actions, into decisions not yet ready to be made. The seal gave him control. It was now time to return. Not to Asgard yet, but to a transitional site he had prepared long ago. A quiet structure hidden in the roots of the tree. There, he would rest, recalibrate, and test the stability of what he now carried. If held, then he could resume his role. If not, he would not return. The shelter was not far. It was a structure embedded into one of the lower roots of Yggdrasil, camouflaged from sight and protected by passive wards. Not traps, just deterrents, enough to dissuade wanderers, but not powerful enough to be mistaken for defense. Inside, the space was simple. A bench, a basin, a flat stone that served as a desk. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for containment. Odin entered and secured the door. He removed the pouch containing the bark. and placed it on the desk. Then he removed his cloak and sat. The first thing he did was review his thoughts. He checked for inconsistencies, distortions, or emotional disruptions. The will's knowledge had been stable upon transfer, but that didn't guarantee it would remain so. Sometimes, hidden information could provoke reactions hours or days after it was received. He felt none. Next, he reviewed the physical symptoms. Dizziness, vision imbalance, nerve disruption. All normal, all temporary. Finally, he tested his ability to recall. Without looking at the bark, he initiated one of the triggers, a mental key tied to a question about Helheim's boundary function. The response came clearly, precisely as structured. He noted the result and closed the gate. That meant the seal was holding. He repeated this process 2 more times with different triggers. All successful. The knowledge was intact, compressed, and accessible under controlled conditions. This was a good sign. But it was not the final test. There was one more step before he could return to his duties. The final step was exposure to ordinary stimuli. Odin exited the shelter and returned to the upper clearing. There he sat near a spring, shallow, clean, natural. It was the kind of place frequented by lower spirits and occasional travelers. He waited. Eventually, a fox appeared, then a bird, then a faint mist moved across the soil. Life resumed in small doses. The world had moved on while he was beneath it. This was the test: to remain present, to engage with the ordinary without letting the deep knowledge distort perception. Odin focused on the sounds, the temperature, the minor movements of the creatures around him. He breathed normally. He did not anticipate threats or solutions. He let the moment pass as it was. The test succeeded. The knowledge had settled. It would not interfere unless summoned. That was what made him ready to return. He stood, retrieved the pouch, and started walking. The journey back to Asgard would take time, but that no longer mattered. Time moved differently for him now. Not faster, not slower, just clearer. He had paid the price. He had sealed the burden. And when he returned, nothing in Asgard would notice the difference immediately. But over time, they would. Not in his words, but in his choices, in his restraint, in what he built instead of what he destroyed. That was the meaning of the seal. And its consequences were only beginning. Before he left the clearing entirely, Odin turned one last time toward the flat stone where he had marked the seal. It looked unremarkable, weathered, forgotten, but he knew what it meant. In times ahead, when the weight of events would press down on Asgard, when Ragnarok would inch closer with each broken alliance and each foretold betrayal, he might return here, not to ask for more, but to remember why he had stopped asking. Wisdom was not just accumulation, it was containment, discipline, memory with boundaries. He walked away, slow but steady. Each step carried both what he had learned and what he had let go. There would be no celebration on his return, no tale told, because this was not a triumph, it was maintenance of order, of awareness, of cost. And as the light broke gently through the boughs of Yggdrasil, Odin disappeared once again, lessened in body, sharpened in mind, marked forever by what he had chosen to see. Odin crossed the threshold into Asgard without fanfare. He did not announce his return. No horn sounded, no ravens flew ahead. He entered through a lesser-known gate, one used in earlier eras when the gods still walked unnoticed among mortals and other realms. The guards stationed nearby recognized him immediately, but did not question his presence. They bowed slightly and stepped aside. His appearance was different, but the authority was unchanged. As he passed into the inner circle of the realm, the silence of his journey continued. The streets were not empty, but those who saw him moved quietly. They sensed the change. He walked without rush toward the high keep, his quarters and planning chamber. The halls inside were as they had always been, vast, echoing, filled with the weight of decisions made and waiting to be made. Frigg was not there. Neither were Thor nor Tyr. This was intentional. Odin had returned early, before anyone expected him. He needed time to assess how much he had changed before others did. Once inside the keep, he entered the central chamber and closed the door behind him. He stood for a long moment without speaking or moving. The space felt both familiar and distant. He removed his cloak and placed it over the nearest chair. Then he approached the long table where he and the others had often debated matters of war, law, and alliance. Nothing on the surface had changed. Maps were still there, stones marking troop positions, notes written in runes for future discussion. But Odin now saw it all differently. For the well, these tools represented control, ways to predict and contain chaos. Now they looked like approximations, useful, but incomplete. He sat down and began reviewing recent reports left by his advisors. Movements in Midgard, border tensions in Vanaheim, anomalies in the branches near Jotunheim. All expected, all manageable, but Odin didn't skim. He read carefully, slowly. Not to find threats, but to measure his new lens against old information. He finished reading. Then he called for a scribe. The scribe entered within minutes, carrying a set of scrolls and a fresh quill. He bowed, awaiting instruction. Odin didn't give a speech. He pointed to a clean scroll and spoke in short, precise phrases. Draft a record, he said, private, to be stored in the sealed archives. The scribe nodded and began writing. Odin dictated a summary of recent divine council meetings. Decisions made, conflict unresolved, alliances in flux. It wasn't new information, but this time he added something different, context. He didn't just report outcomes. He included motives, risks, patterns of behavior. He framed choices in terms of long-term consequences, not to criticize, but to map them. The scribe wrote without interruption. This was not for the council. It was for Odin's future self, and perhaps for a successor, if one proved worthy. When the document was complete, Odin dismissed him and sealed the scroll personally with wax and a private sigil. It would go in a vault that only he could access. This was the beginning of a different kind of leadership. After sealing the record, Odin remained seated. He was not tired, but deliberate. He knew that everyone would come looking for him soon. His return would trigger questions about what he had seen, what he had gained, and what he might now intend. He would answer carefully, not because he intended to hide the truth, but because unfiltered truth could destabilize trust. Wisdom had to be released in portions. Readiness mattered more than urgency. Later that day, Thor entered the chamber. No appointment, no guard. He stopped a few paces from Odin and looked at his face, then at the empty eye socket. "You gave it," Thor said. Odin nodded. Thor didn't press. Instead, he asked, "Did it give you what you needed?" "No," Odin replied. "It gave me what I lacked." Thor sat. They couldn't speak for several minutes. It was not silence out of tension. It was the kind that comes when one understands the stakes of a conversation and waits for it to unfold naturally. Finally, Odin said, "There are things I will change, not out of fear, out of preparation." Thor listened. He would ask more later. For now, this was enough. Word of Odin's return spread quickly. By evening, the council had been summoned, not by decree, but by pattern. The return of the Allfather meant things would move. And when things moved in Asgard, the other realms paid attention. Frigg was the first to arrive. She embraced Odin, quietly noting the change without asking questions. She had always known this moment would come. Her concern wasn't what he had done. It was whether he had returned intact. He had. Tyr arrived next, then Sif, then Heimdall, and later Freyr. Each took their place around the table. The tone was respectful, but different. There was caution in the air. Odin was watching everything, listening, not just for answers, but for intent. The council proceeded with routine updates. Odin listened without interrupting. He let others speak freely. He asked only 2 questions, both about timing, not judgment. When the meeting ended, no one raised their voice. There were no declarations, but each member left with the sense that something foundational had shifted. And they were right. That night, Odin stood alone at the edge of the balcony, overlooking the outer ring of Asgard. The sky was clear. The stars were static. From this height, everything seemed orderly. But he knew better. The events in other realms were not visible from here, but they were already in motion. The well had shown him the first signs of disruption. Minor shifts in loyalty, resource strain in Alfheim, unease in the border clans of Svartalfheim. Not enough to panic anyone, but enough to warn someone who knew where to look. He would not respond with force, not yet. He would shift policy quietly, reallocate resources, deploy scouts instead of soldiers, invest in messengers instead of weapons. He would watch. More importantly, he would listen. The eye he had given was not simply lost. It had been exchanged. What he gained in return was not just insight, but new priorities. He could no longer afford to operate from assumption. Every alliance, every treaty, every silence now required scrutiny. This was the shape of leadership after the well. 2 days later, Odin made one final adjustment. He entered the vault beneath the keep, accessible only by his voice and hand. Inside, he stored the sealed bark from Yggdrasil within a stone compartment, layered between unmarked slabs. No labels, no warnings, just the object and the space. Before closing the vault, he placed a second object beside it, a blank scroll. It would remain empty for now, but it had a purpose. One day, someone else might come looking for answers. Not power, not position, but understanding. And if they did, and if they reached this place with the right intent, the blank scroll would become their canvas. This was Odin's quiet contingency. The realm did not need another god of war. It would need someone who understood what knowledge cost, and why restraint mattered more than dominance. When he resealed the vault, he felt no relief, only readiness. He returned upstairs, resumed his position, and gave no speeches, just presence, because that was now enough. Later that evening, as the halls quieted and torches dimmed, Odin sat alone once again. This time, not to reflect, but to rehearse. He recited scenarios in his mind, not speeches, sequences, cause and effect. He tested decisions against potential responses, not as a prophet, but as a planner. The well had not given him certainty. It had given him mental discipline. And now each moment demanded that discipline. He did not write down his thoughts. He did not record a plan. There was no blueprint for what came next, only a posture, a stance toward events that had yet to unfold. This was the burden of returning, to appear unchanged while everything within had shifted. In time, the others would notice, not because he told them, but because their strategies would start to fail, and his would start to hold. And when they asked why, he would not explain. He would simply say, "I prepared differently," and they would understand, eventually. Outside, Asgard held its shape. The walls stood, the guards rotated, the sky turned. But at the center of it all, in silence and without spectacle, the future of the realm had already shifted, and no one had yet realized it. Odin stood before the mirror in his private chamber. There were no enchantments on the glass. It reflected only what was present. His face creased by age and war, his posture rigid, deliberate, and the space where his right eye had once been, now hollow, closed by a thin scar. He studied it without judgment. The missing eye was not a wound. It was an event, a marker. But it also left a question. What remained? The well had taken one eye, but he still had the other. And that remaining eye now carried more than sight. It carried responsibility. This section was not about what was lost. It was about what was left, and what he chose to do with it. In the weeks that followed his return, Odin used his remaining eye differently. Before the well, he had used it to judge, to scan battlefields, to evaluate threats, to analyze allies for signs of hesitation or defiance. Now he used it to track change. He began observing not just what people did, but how they responded when things didn't go their way. Not just decisions, but reactions. Emotional tells, cognitive habits. It wasn't surveillance, it was calibration. He needed to understand the leadership culture he had built. Not from reports, from behavior. He met with Frigg more often, not to strategize, but to listen. She had always held perspectives he overlooked, not due to malice, but because his focus had been narrowly set on control. Now he took her objections seriously. He didn't always agree, but he included her logic in his planning. He asked Tyr about the outer garrisons, not just their readiness, but their morale. He asked Heimdall about the mood in the Bifrost corridors, not just its structural stability. Every answer was data. The eye remained open. But this time, it was used for reflection, not dominance. He also used his remaining eye to observe patterns in places he once ignored. The training fields, the record halls, the healing wards. He noticed how the younger warriors mirrored Thor's impulsive instincts more than his strategy. He saw how the archivists prioritized heroic deeds over long-term consequences. He noted that healers were understaffed in peacetime, because Asgard expected damage only when war erupted, not from the slow erosion of the fatigue and stress. These were blind spots, ones he had allowed. Not anymore. He didn't reprimand anyone. He didn't initiate reforms overnight. He simply documented, quietly, thoroughly. And once the data was complete, he started making minor adjustments, just enough to shift the balance without triggering resistance. He altered how missions were assigned, who trained new soldiers, how information was classified. The remaining eye watched for feedback. It tracked whether the system absorbed change or rejected it. Some changes were accepted easily. Others triggered confusion. A few were opposed outright. That was expected. But what mattered was that his eye now looked beyond outcomes. It measured alignment between intention and action. He also used his remaining eye to observe Loki, not to confront him, not to accuse, but to understand. Loki was clever, always a step ahead of expectation, but Odin now watched for patterns beneath the performance. He tracked when Loki offered solutions and when he provoked problems, when he stepped forward and when he remained just out of reach. He began to build a profile, not of Loki's intentions, but of his thresholds. How far could he be pushed before he shifted allegiance? What incentives kept him loyal? What events triggered instability? Odin didn't share these observations. He didn't create a file. He internalized them. Because the well had taught him that preventing betrayal was rarely about catching lies. It was about identifying fractures before they became breaks. With his remaining eye, he wasn't looking for confirmation. He was looking for pressure points, the ones that could be reinforced or exploited if necessary. This wasn't cold strategy. It was survival. And now that he understood the stakes, Odin treated every relationship as dynamic, not fixed. Even among gods, loyalty had conditions. He also used his remaining eye to observe himself. This was the most difficult task. He monitored how quickly he dismissed others' concerns, how often he relied on past victories as justification, how frequently he expected obedience instead of feedback. He documented his own defaults. The well hadn't changed his instincts. It had changed his awareness of them. And that awareness made a difference. He began delegating differently, not just to distribute tasks, but to test trust, to see who would adapt without oversight, who would anticipate without instruction. He stopped using Gungnir as a symbol of dominance. It remained by his side, but he no longer planted it into the ground to end arguments. He let discussion run longer. He waited before concluding. This was not weakness. It was recalibration. The old Odin used force to finalize. The current Odin used silence to reveal. And his remaining eye tracked the effects. Meetings were longer, but more productive. Fewer warriors were injured during training. More junior officials stepped forward with plans, not just requests. Change wasn't fast, but it was visible. He also used his remaining eye to revisit past decisions. He returned to old transcripts of trials. He reread records of banishments and punishments, not to undo them, but to analyze them. Had the punishments been necessary? Had the outcomes been just? More importantly, were those events remembered accurately by those affected? He began discreetly sending emissaries to those who had been exiled or displaced, not with apologies, with questions. How had they interpreted what happened? What had they learned? Would they return if asked? Some refused. Others responded with guarded interest. Odin made no promises, but he listened. The well had shown him how easily history hardened into myth, and how myth, when unchallenged, became blind policy. Now he used his remaining eye to see those blind spots. He recorded them in a private ledger, separate from Asgard's archives, not because he feared exposure, but because the realm wasn't ready to confront every past error. Yet. But he would be, and when the time came, he would act from knowledge, not from narrative. Toward the end of that season, Odin made one final use of his remaining eye. He trained it on the next generation. He spent time with the younger warriors, not to instruct them in combat, but to ask what they feared, what they hoped for, and what they assumed about their future roles. Their answers told him everything. Most assumed power would pass by proximity, that lineage or achievement alone would determine who would lead. None mentioned preparation. Few considered sacrifice. That, Odin realized, was the true gap. So he began to shift the culture. Subtly, he introduced more tests of thought over strength, missions that required negotiation instead of force, simulations where the goal was stability, not conquest. At first, some resisted, but others rose. He took note. The well had cost him an eye. It had given him vision in return. But that vision only mattered if it changed what came next. So he focused it. He did not seek to see everything, only what mattered. And now, with one eye gone, he saw more than ever, not because he had less, but because he looked with intent. One evening, he stood once more before the mirror. He looked not at the missing eye, but into the one that remained. It didn't glow with power. It didn't blaze with foresight. It simply held focus. He remembered the moment before he dropped the eye into the well. The hesitation, the pain, the commitment. Now, with only one, he saw what he'd never noticed before. How vision was never about the amount of light that entered, but about the clarity with which you processed what stayed. He saw himself fully, not as a god among gods, but as the current bearer of a long chain of decisions, some wise, some flawed, all consequential. And in that still moment, he understood what the well had demanded. Not pain, not obedience, but refinement. The eye that remained was not a spare, it was the test, to see if he could lead with one more clearly than he ever did with two. He turned from the mirror, not with resolve, but with precision. And outside, the realm continued on, unaware that its greatest shift had already begun, not through force, but through focus. While Odin continued his life in Asgard, the well remained still. No ripples, no glow, no movement. But within it, something had changed. The eye he had given did not decay. It did not drift to the bottom like a discarded relic. It had been absorbed, not destroyed. And in that absorption, it became something else. A node, a link between two realms of perception. This section is not about Odin. It is about the eye, what it saw, what it retained, and what it began to reflect back. The eye no longer belonged to a body, but it was not inert. It began recording, not in the sense of storing images, but in capturing motion, intent, and structure. Patterns in the flows of the well. The liquids in the basin were not simple water. They carried memory, energy, and a logic that moved through events like currents through a river. The eye now bonded to that logic, adapted. It saw differently. It began observing connections between decisions across time. How a hesitation in Midgard affected a political shift in Elfheim. How a forgotten insult in Vanaheim would ripple toward betrayal decades later. The eye had no emotions. It did not judge. It categorized. In the deep recesses of the well, what the eye saw began to accumulate as layers. Not layers of thought, but conditions. If certain conditions returned, the eye would respond. It did not need permission. It had been exchanged freely, and now it functioned as part of a larger system. Its purpose was no longer vision. Its purpose was awareness. The eye's presence altered the behavior of the well itself. Before, the well had served as a one-way conduit. Those who approached it asked, and it answered. Now, with the eye embedded within, the well became reactive, selective. It began filtering what it revealed, based not only on the seeker's question, but on the alignment of their intent. Some who came seeking knowledge found only silence. Others found images they didn't understand, memories not their own. A few were shown fragments from other realms entirely, moments not yet realized. The guardians of the well, once passive, began to notice the shift. The waters were less predictable. Patterns moved faster. Echoes of thoughts not spoken aloud began forming at the surface before fading into mist. The eye did not float. It did not shine. But it became central. It was not a watcher. It was a mechanism. And as it calibrated to the flow of time, it began shaping which truths would be revealed and which would be withheld. This was not manipulation. It was balance. For the first time, the well was not just a source of knowledge. It had become an editor. 1 century later, a scholar from Alfheim approached the well with a question about celestial decay. The well remained still. Then it showed her a memory, not of her realm, but of a mountain collapsing in Muspelheim centuries earlier. It made no logical sense. She left confused. But 2 years after that vision, the star above her home dimmed unexpectedly, and the decay followed the same pattern as the collapse she had witnessed. The memory had been a warning disguised as irrelevance. The eye had filtered her question, not to deny her, but to make her ready. It had learned how to prepare minds for truths they wouldn't accept if delivered directly. This became its core function. The eye served no master, not even Odin. It did not seek outcomes. It maintained equilibrium. And as centuries passed, the well's behavior changed further. Some started to think it had grown colder, more distant, but those who approached with clear purpose and without entitlement began to receive better answers, cleaner signals, more precision. The eye had become a translator of readiness, and those who were not ready saw nothing at all. There were rumors about the change. Some said the well had been cursed. Others claimed it had become sentient. A few whispered that a fragment of Odin himself lingered inside it, guiding who lived and who failed. None of this was accurate. The truth was more stable and less dramatic. The well had integrated a tool. The eye was not conscious. It had no will, but it was precise. Its criteria had shifted from curiosity to consequence. The more significant the question, the stricter the requirements for response. This frustrated many, especially gods and rulers who had once demanded answers and received them instantly. Now they were shown silence, or fragments, or memories they assumed irrelevant. Some stopped coming. The well did not care. But others, those who approached in quiet with discipline and patience, began to understand the new rules. They treated the well less like a source of power and more like a mirror. The eye within it did not reflect their faces. It reflected their intent. And once that was stable, the well responded. Not quickly, but clearly. One of the most important interactions came from a minor deity, unnamed in most records, who arrived with no question. He sat beside the well for 3 days without speaking. On the 4th day, he asked nothing. He simply watched. The well stirred. It revealed a vision, not of his past or future, but of someone else's. A child not yet born in Vonheim. A decision she would make. A price she would pay. The deity left without comment. But decades later, when that child came of age, he intervened to prevent a choice that would have doomed thousands. He never explained how he knew. Only the well understood. And the eye had chosen to show him not what he wanted, but what he was suited to act upon. This became the standard. The eye did not reward knowledge seeking. It rewarded readiness to carry weight. Over time, this shaped not only how the well was used, but who dared to approach it. And eventually, stories of the eye in the well replaced older tales of its chaos. because it no longer offered chaos. It offered structure with consequences. Centuries passed, then millennia. The well remained. Its waters shifted, but never spilled. Its presence remained unguarded, but never unchallenged. It demanded discipline simply through how it functioned. The eye within it had become more than a relic. It had become infrastructure, a foundational mechanism inside a system older than memory. Some began to wonder, if the eye could change the well, what would happen if another sacrifice were made? A second eye, a deeper question, but no one dared. The memory of Odin's sacrifice still held weight, not because it was legend, but because the result was permanent. The eye had not granted him foresight. It had anchored a new condition into reality, and the cost had made others hesitate. The well had learned something through the eye. Permanence was not achieved by force or prophecy. It was achieved by clarity. And so it waited, not idly, but actively, filtering, measuring, maintaining balance without calling attention to itself. Like any great system, its power was clearest in its restraint. Back in Asgard, few spoke of the eye. Even Odin, though aware, never returned to retrieve it. He understood something others didn't. The moment he gave it up, it stopped being his. He had made a trade, not for insight, but for function. And now that function operated without loyalty or memory. That was the point. In the end, the eye had become something rare in all the realms, an impartial force. It could not be corrupted, flattered, or deceived. It simply reflected the truth when the conditions aligned. And that, more than prophecy or vision, made it the most dangerous and most valuable tool object in existence. Not because of what it showed, but because of what it didn't. Those who learned to listen without demand, to seek without arrogance, and to accept without flinching, those were the ones it served. Everyone else simply stared into still water and left with nothing. And so the well remained, quiet beneath the roots of Yggdrasil. It did not rise. It did not fall. It simply endured. Inside, the eye waited, not for a command, not for recognition, but for the next moment of alignment. A question formed in clarity. A seeker stripped of ego. A truth ready to be handled. When that moment came, the well would move again. Not loudly, but exactly. Because the eye did not serve gods, it served balance, and balance never rested. In the aftermath of Odin's return, a shift began within the council. Not immediately, not by decree, but gradually, through pauses, glances, and the things left unsaid. They had welcomed him back. They had listened, but none of them had asked the real question out loud. What did the sacrifice cost? They saw the missing eye. They saw the altered posture. But they didn't know what had been exchanged, and none of them wanted to be the first to ask. This is the story of what happened when gods chose silence over inquiry, and how that silence became its own form of decision. The Council of Asgard had never been a uniform body. Each god represented more than power. They represented competing priorities. Tyr pushed for readiness, Frigg for preservation, Heimdall for vigilance, Sif for resilience, Thor, predictably, for decisive action. Before Odin's departure, disagreement was common, but it was open. Arguments happened in the open chamber, often loud, sometimes heated, but always visible. After his return, that changed. Meetings were quieter, not because there was more agreement, but because there was more calculation. Fewer statements, more watching. Everyone sensed the change in Odin, but none could name it. He didn't interrupt, he didn't direct, he simply listened. And that unsettled them more than any command ever had. His silence wasn't passive, it was evaluative. Each council member adjusted. Some doubled down on their usual stances. Others grew hesitant, unsure if their instincts still aligned with what Odin now saw. And gradually, the room began to divide, not by alliances, but by posture. Some leaned forward, others held back. The council had not fractured, but it had thinned, and no one said a word about it. Odin noticed it all. He did not document it. He did not address it in private, but he noted how Tyr stopped challenging numbers, how Frigg began rewording her concerns into observations, how Heimdall spoke only when asked. Even Thor, bold as ever, began glancing toward Odin before speaking. Just for a moment, but always. Odin did not return the glances. This was not punishment, it was reflection. He had changed the structure of the council by simply being different. And now the others were adjusting to a center that no longer held the same gravity. But instead of acknowledging the change, they adapted in silence. That silence had consequences. Minor decisions began to stall. Initiatives were delayed. No one wanted to push too far without knowing where Odin stood. And since he no longer declared positions, uncertainty grew. The council became reactive instead of proactive. No one challenged this openly, but privately discomfort rose. Some wondered if the All-Father's wisdom had cost him decisiveness. Others feared that questioning him would be seen as defiance. And so, slowly, they chose a third option. Detachment. Show up. Speak minimally. Avoid risk. Let the silence do the heavy lifting. Odin saw this too, and he allowed it. Not because he approved of their behavior, but because he wanted to know who would eventually speak. Every meeting became a test, not of loyalty, but of clarity. Who could think independently? Who could act without guidance? Who would resist the gravity of silence? In the early months, no one did. But one evening, during a closed session on boundary disputes with the Vanir, Sif spoke directly. She did not preface her point. She did not defer to Odin. She laid out a position, complete with implications and risks. When she finished, the room waited. Odin nodded once, then resumed listening. The others noticed. The next week, Tyr presented a draft proposal without consensus. Heimdall submitted an analysis based on his own surveillance. Even Frigg stopped softening her language. It was slow, but steady. The council began to breathe again. Not loudly, not with the old chaos, but with initiative. And Odin kept listening. That became the new order. One formed not by vote, but by observation. The council had gone silent. Then it had adapted. Now it was re-emerging, not because Odin demanded it, but because his silence had created a vacuum. And the right leaders stepped into it. Odin's role remained consistent. He didn't explain his silence. He didn't reward participation. He didn't correct hesitation. He simply held space. This had not been his old approach. He once believed that leadership meant direction. Clear lines, decisive answers, visible strength. Now, he operated more like a boundary. He defined the edges and watched who filled the interior, and what he saw was revealing. Some council members were better when left alone. Others required structure. A few drifted unless engaged, It wasn't judgment, it was insight. Over time, Odin began to reorganize the rhythm of council business around these observations. He didn't remove anyone. He realigned responsibilities. Those who acted with initiative were given more ambiguity. Those who hesitated were given tighter scopes. Those who asked better questions were pulled into strategic conversations. It was quiet restructuring. No one was demoted, but everyone felt the shift. The silence had done what no decree could. It had exposed the default mode of each leader. And once exposed, Odin reshaped the council accordingly. Outside the council chamber, others took notice. Mid-level advisors and scribes began adjusting their reports. Fewer embellishments, more precision. They weren't told to do this, but the culture had shifted. Decisions were being made on the basis of who spoke, not how loudly. This filtered downward. In the barracks, training regimens became less about volume and more about outcome. In the halls of record, archivists shifted their criteria from dramatics to impact. Odin's silence had begun as a presence only within the council. Now it was reshaping the entire leadership structure of Asgard, and no one had written a policy. The ripple effect was measurable. Frigg noticed it in how domestic requests were phrased. Heimdall saw it in how Outer Rim guards filed reports. Even Thor, resistant to change, began spending more time reviewing than reacting. The realm hadn't quieted, it had refined, and at the center of it all sat the silent council, no longer passive, no longer posturing, just attentive, capable, stable. In time, outsiders took notice too. Envoys from other realms, Alfheim, Vanaheim, even Jotunheim, remarked on the change dynamic. Fewer proclamations, more results. They couldn't pinpoint why, but they understood something fundamental. The Council of Asgard now acted with deliberate unity. Not agreement, but coherence. It made negotiations faster, it made Asgard harder to manipulate. And though Odin rarely spoke, his presence shaped every room. This became the lasting lesson of the Silent Council, that discipline could spread without instruction, that leadership could emerge without declaration, that silence could shape structure more effectively than speech. The council still debated, still disagreed, but they did so within a framework that held firm, not from laws, but from practice. And Odin, in his stillness, watched the outcome of his gravest experiment. He had sacrificed an eye to see. Now he led through what he didn't say, and the realm followed, not because it feared him, but because it had learned to hear what was not spoken. For a long time, the question did not return. No one asked why Odin had done it. No one asked what he had seen. The silence had hardened into normalcy. The council adapted. The realm adjusted. The well continued to function. But questions, unlike answers, have weight. And weight does not disappear. It waits. This is the story of how the question came back. Not from a god, not from an enemy, but from someone who didn't know they weren't supposed to ask. It began with a scribe. She was young, appointed to record proceedings in the lower halls. Her name rarely appeared in records. Her assignments were clerical, not strategic. But she paid attention. She noticed how Odin paused before entering the chamber, how his gaze rarely lingered, how the council deferred, not in fear, but in adjustment. She didn't understand it, so she asked. Not in the council chamber, not in a formal letter. She asked aloud, one evening in a side corridor, to another junior scribe. What exactly did Odin see? The question wasn't meant as challenge. It was curiosity. But it traveled. It moved faster than anyone expected. The scribe's question was repeated, not formally, but in whispers, among archivists, assistants, gatekeepers. The question wasn't taboo. It was simply one no one dared to ask before. And now that it had been spoken, it couldn't be unsaid. What did Odin see? Some dismissed it. Others speculated. A few asked themselves if the sacrifice had been worth it. And just like that, silence cracked. The council noticed. At first, they tried to ignore it. Then some began floating new discussions, debates around vision, sacrifice, responsibility. None mentioned Odin's eye directly, but the topic lingered underneath every line. Eventually, it reached Odin, not as a confrontation, as an echo. He didn't respond immediately. He waited to see who would bring it to him directly. Not to punish, to assess. It was Heimdall who approached first. He didn't ask the question outright. Instead, he referenced a shift in surveillance activity, claims that more people were visiting the borders of the well. He didn't speculate why, but Odin understood. The question was moving. A few days later, Frigg raised a proposal for a historical review of major divine sacrifices, framed as educational but clearly timed. Odin allowed it. He said nothing. That silence was its own form of permission. The review passed, the archive requests tripled, and beneath it all, the original question continued to grow. What had Odin seen? Why had it changed him? Was it meant for him alone? Or had he taken something that once belonged to all? Some began to treat the question as dangerous. They feared it would destabilize the quiet order the council had built. Others argued that asking was healthy, that myths left unexamined become policy without consent. In time, the scribe who first asked it was called to speak, not in judgment, but to clarify what she meant. Her answer was simple. I wanted to know what made him give something no one else would. That reframed the question. It was no longer about what Odin saw. It was about why he acted. The council debated whether to issue a formal statement. Odin declined. He said only one thing. If they want to know what I saw, they should ask the well. That was not a deflection. It was a direction, and for the first time in generations, a new line formed at the base of the world tree, not of kings, not of warriors, but of citizens, thinkers, and quiet seekers. The well stirred again. Some who approached the well found nothing. Others saw glimpses, unclear, symbolic, or jarring. But what they received wasn't vision, it was contest. The well didn't show them what Odin saw, it showed them why seeing mattered. One saw a friend's betrayal before it happened. Another saw themselves failing a child. A third saw nothing until they returned weeks later and saw their own death, not as tragedy, but as turning point for others. The eye in the well didn't reveal prophecy. It revealed consequence. And those who walked away changed, understood something Odin had known for centuries. That seeing isn't about knowing. It's about choosing what to carry. The scribe, now assigned to full clerical duty in the council chamber, never asked the question again. She didn't need to. She had gone to the well, and she had been shown her own burden. That was enough. In the months that followed, the council adjusted again. They began incorporating perspectives from those who visited the well, not as doctrine, but as data, an expanding map of how perception shaped behavior. The well became a kind of compass, not for navigation, but for readiness. A few tried to manipulate the process, pretending to have visions, spreading interpretations. The council ignored them. The well did not. Those who lied found nothing the next time they returned. No image, no sound, just cold silence. It became clear that the well did not tolerate vanity. And so gradually, reverence returned, but not the old kind, not rooted in fear. This reverence came from discipline, from understanding that truth was available but never owed, that answers could be shown but never demanded, that Odin's choice had not been about what he gained, but about what he had surrendered permanently, so that others might see differently. Eventually, new protocols emerged, unwritten but respected. Those who visited the well were expected to wait before speaking. Some waited days, others months. Only after reflection could they share what they saw, if they chose to. There was no pressure to explain. The value came from the change observed in those who returned. Odin observed this quietly. He never commented on the question again, but he paid attention to how the realm responded. What began as a single inquiry had led to something more profound, a cultural shift in how Asgard treated knowledge, power, and sacrifice. The question had returned, and this time it had not fractured the realm. It had matured it. Odin did not resume his old leadership style. He didn't return to commands or declarations. He remained watchful because he understood what had happened. For the first time since he sacrificed his eye, someone else had chosen to see without being forced. And that meant the responsibility of vision had finally been shared. What Odin had seen in the well would never be made public. Not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer needed to be. The exact vision wasn't the point. What mattered was that others now asked better questions. Not about prophecy, but about consequence. Not about fate, but about readiness. The well had become more than a place. It was now a method of inquiry, of calibration, of maturity. And the question that once sat in silence had completed its journey. Not with an answer, but with transformation. In the end, a scribe was promoted to oversee council documentation. She never sought power, but she became trusted, not because of what she saw, but because of how she listened, and how she waited before speaking. The question returned, and it left behind something Odin had always hoped for, but never demanded. A generation willing to ask with humility, and strong enough to carry what they might see. It did not begin with an omen. There were no storms, no strange alignments, no celestial signs. It began with a quiet decision. Someone, young, unremarkable by title, unknown beyond their village, walked away from their life and began heading toward the well. No orders had been given. No call had been issued, but something had changed. For generations, the well had received questions. Now, someone was approaching it with an offer. Not to take, but to give. The person's name was not recorded. No scribes followed, no guards intervened, no omens flared overhead. But word spread, not of who was going, but that someone was going at all. The well had always demanded sacrifice, yes, but only once had it been given without negotiation. Odin's eye had opened the structure. This, whatever it was, might alter it. The council was informed, but they did not send emissaries. Frigg advised restraint. Heimdall watched from afar, but did not interfere. Even Thor, known for impulsiveness, said nothing. They all understood the moment required distance, because this time, no one had asked the realm to bear witness. Someone had simply decided, and in doing so, they returned the act of sacrifice to its original state. Private, deliberate, irreversible. The walk through the well took days. There were no guards, no rituals, no crowds, only the wind and the quiet shape of Yggdrasil in the distance. Along the way, the traveler passed old markers, stones left from older pilgrimages, most of them now forgotten. No one had approached the well in this way for centuries. But the well did not forget. It stirred days before the traveler arrived, not in anticipation, but in calibration. The eye within it, long silent, began processing new conditions, not of questions, but of intent, the kind that couldn't be faked. When the traveler arrived, they didn't speak. They knelt, then waited. There was no ceremony, just silence. And for a long time, nothing happened. Then the surface of the water shifted, not outward, inward, as if pulling the moment down into itself. The travelers stood, opened their hand, and placed something into the water. It was not an eye, it was not blood. It was something no one had ever given. A memory, willingly surrendered, not erased, offered. The well accepted it. The water didn't glow, the eye didn't rise. There were no signs of magic. But something irreversible had occurred. A piece of identity, voluntarily detached, now existed within the well, and that changed its structure again. The well had always responded to seekers. Now it responded to contributors. A second kind of relationship was forming, not transactional, but integrative. The traveler did not wait for approval. They bowed once, turned, and left. They remembered less now. Not amnesia, just distance. One thread removed from the web of their mind, but they walked straighter. Something had been released. Back at the council, reports arrived quietly. No ceremony was held, but the significance wasn't lost. This wasn't just a moment. It was a shift in pattern. Sacrifice had returned, not as reaction, but as initiation. And the well, for the first time since Odin, had accepted a gift without being asked to give anything in return. That meant the rules were still evolving, and that terrified some, but it awakened others. Over the following weeks, others came, not many, just a few. Some brought offerings, others brought moments, memories, regrets, quiet choices they no longer wished to carry. The well did not respond to all of them. It rejected posturing. It rejected fear disguised as humility. It rejected spectacle, but it accepted the sincere. And each acceptance reshaped its internal balance. The eye, long a filter for inquiry, now became something else. A curator of cost. It didn't judge the scale of the offering. It measured the depth of the intent behind it. The council took notice. Discussions resumed. Should this be regulated, recorded, prevented? Frigg warned against interference. Tyr argued for structure. Odin said nothing, but he watched, and eventually he issued one statement, delivered without emotion. The well now listens to what we surrender. Speak carefully. It was not a warning. It was context. The realm was entering a new phase, one where sacrifice no longer waited for crisis. It arrived by choice. A deeper change followed. In the outer provinces, quiet traditions began to form. People lit small candles, not as worship, but as acknowledgement of what they were willing to let go. Not all traveled to the well. Most didn't need to. The idea had spread. Sacrifice was no longer about pain. It was about participation. The gods began to adjust. Sif began speaking differently about strength, less about force, more about restraint. Heimdall started logging incidents where decisions were delayed, not as failures, but as marks of maturity. Even Thor, though skeptical, refrained from making judgments on things he didn't fully understand. Odin remained still. He had started a process he never expected to finish. He had given something. Now others were giving too. Not because they were told, but because they were ready. The well responded less frequently now. It didn't need to answer everything. Its purpose had evolved. It had become less like a mirror and more like a ledger, not of power, of responsibility. What had once been a divine act was now a distributed one, not diluted, refined. Then came the child. No one sent him. He was not accompanied. He had no family name known to the council. But he reached the well with steady steps and no hesitation. Witnesses said he said nothing. He looked into the water, reached into his pocket, and dropped a small wooden carving, something he'd made himself. A toy, a symbol. The well stirred, and for the first time in decades, it showed a vision to an entire crowd. No words, no images, just a shared feeling of release, of transition, of an old weight finally settling into balance. The council received the report in silence. Odin read it, set it down, and closed his eyes. Then he said quietly, "It's begun." No one asked what he meant. They didn't need to. The new era was no longer hypothetical. It had arrived, and its foundation was not conquest, prophecy, or strength. It was surrender, offered freely. A power few had ever mastered. Until now, what followed was not revolution. There were no sudden changes in government, no divine proclamations. What changed was tone. Meetings grew shorter. Disputes lost their sharpness. People began to pause, not out of fear, but out of awareness that what they gave could matter more than what they gained. The well remained the same, but its meaning had shifted. It was no longer only a destination, it was a measure. A place that asked without voice, "What will you offer, knowing you may receive nothing?" And more people answered, not with words, but with actions. Sacrifice was no longer symbolic, it was operational. The culture shifted quietly, but permanently. And Odin, now older than ever, understood what had occurred. The eye he gave had not shown him a vision. It had built a template. And only now, after centuries, was the realm finally ready to inhabit it. Not just the gods, everyone. Sacrifice had become common, not dramatic, not theatrical, just essential. And that, Odin knew, was the real transformation. Not what the well had become, but what Asgard had chosen to become in response to it.